What if I told you that the deaths of 4 American presidents weren't just tragedies, but doorways into cover-ups, missing files and questions that historians still argue about over a century later? What if the official story you learned in school was carefully sanded down, missing the strange details, the ignored warnings, the witnesses who were never called, and the evidence that mysteriously vanished? You probably think you know how Lincoln died. Maybe you remember Garfield as a name from a textbook. McKinley barely registers. And Kennedy, well, Kennedy you've heard 100 versions of, most of them shouted by someone at a dinner party. But here's the thing. The real history is stranger and more layered than any conspiracy theory could dream up. Some of these secrets are documented facts hiding in plain sight. Others are theories that respectable historians still debate without agreement. We'll tell you which is which as we go, because separating fact from speculation is the whole point of tonight's journey. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull that blanket up a little higher, because we're about to spend the next while drifting through 100 secrets, strange details, and unresolved mysteries surrounding the 4 presidents America lost to assassins. Before we begin, if stories like this help you unwind and drift off, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need a calm voice and a strange piece of history to fall asleep to. Now, let's start where this whole dark thread begins, in a theater in Washington, D.C., on a Friday night in April 1865, with a president who had just watched the Civil War finally come to an end, a bodyguard who mysteriously wasn't at his post, and a killer who somehow walked freely through a building full of soldiers. 1. Lincoln's first threat letter. Abraham Lincoln started receiving death threats before he even took office. Between his election in November 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861, hundreds of threatening letters poured in. Southern secessionists were furious. Some letters described elaborate assassination plots. Others were simple, chilling promises that he wouldn't survive to be president. Lincoln kept a folder of these threats, tucked away in his desk. His secretaries later said he mostly brushed them off, joking darkly that if someone truly wanted him dead, no amount of security could stop a determined killer willing to trade his own life for it. He turned out to be right, but not for another 4 years. What's remarkable is how normalized these threats became. By the time Lincoln reached Washington, threats against his life were so routine that his own staff struggled to distinguish serious danger from empty venom. That struggle to separate real threats from background noise would haunt presidential security for generations, and honestly, it's a problem the Secret Service still wrestles with today. 2. The Baltimore Plot. In February 1861, as President-elect Lincoln traveled by train toward his inauguration, detectives uncovered what they believed was a serious assassination plan targeting him in Baltimore, Maryland. The city was a hotbed of Southern sympathizers, and Lincoln's route required him to switch trains there, walking through a public station. Detective Allen Pinkerton and his agents, working independently from the War Department, claimed to have infiltrated a group allegedly plotting to stab or shoot Lincoln during that vulnerable transfer. Historians still debate how real or organized this plot actually was. Some argue it was a genuine conspiracy. Others suggest Pinkerton exaggerated the threat to boost his own reputation. What we know for certain is that Lincoln's advisors took it seriously enough to act, and that decision changed the entire tone of his arrival in the Capitol, turning what should have been a triumphant procession into something far more secretive and tense. 3. Lincoln's secret Baltimore route. Acting on the warnings about a possible attack, Lincoln's team quietly altered his public travel schedule. Instead of proceeding through Baltimore during daylight, escorted by fanfare and crowds, Lincoln slipped through the city in the middle of the night, disguised in a soft hat and overcoat instead of his usual formal attire. He rode in a nearly empty train car, arriving in Washington in the early morning hours, largely unannounced. When the press caught wind of the disguise and secrecy, they mocked him mercilessly. Cartoons depicted him sneaking into the Capitol like a frightened stowaway, wrapped in absurd costumes far more dramatic than reality. It became an early embarrassment of his presidency, even though the decision may well have saved his life. It's a strange historical irony that the man who would eventually die from a very public, very preventable act of violence spent his first night in Washington trying desperately to remain invisible. 4. The Pinkerton Guard. Overseeing Lincoln's secretive journey through Baltimore was Detective Allen Pinkerton, founder of the agency that would eventually bear his name and become synonymous with private security and, later, controversial strikebreaking. Pinkerton had been hired to investigate railroad security threats and stumbled into what he believed was solid evidence of an assassination plot. He personally organized Lincoln's altered route, arranged disguises, and coordinated with a small trusted circle to keep the changed plans secret from almost everyone, including some of Lincoln's own staff. Pinkerton later built much of his professional reputation on having saved the president-elect's life. Whether the threat was as serious as he claimed remains genuinely disputed among historians to this day. What isn't disputed is the irony. Years later, Pinkerton's agency would provide security services again during the Civil War. Yet on the night Lincoln was actually killed at Ford's Theater, it wasn't Pinkerton's men guarding him at all. 5. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker. On the night of April 14, 1865, a Washington police officer named John Parker was assigned to guard the door outside Lincoln's private box at Ford's Theater. At some point during the performance, Parker reportedly left his post, possibly to get a better view of the play from elsewhere in the theater, or according to some accounts, to visit a nearby tavern for a drink. Whatever the reason, his absence left the president's box entirely unprotected at the exact moment John Wilkes Booth approached. Parker was never formally punished for this failure. No court-martial, no real consequences at all. He continued serving on the police force for several more years. Historians still argue about how much blame Parker truly deserves. Was he simply another symptom of remarkably lax security standards at the time? Or did his absence directly enable one of the most consequential assassinations in American history? We'll likely never know for certain. 6. Ford's Theater box door. Even if John Parker had remained at his post, some historians question whether it would have mattered. Investigators later discovered that Booth had prepared the presidential box earlier that same day, boring a small peephole into the door so he could see inside before making his move. More importantly, he wedged a wooden brace, some say a piece of a music stand or a plank, between the door and the wall behind him after entering, effectively barricading anyone from bursting in to stop him or pursue him immediately afterward. This detail reveals just how carefully premeditated the assassination truly was. Booth wasn't acting on some sudden, desperate impulse. He had scouted the theater, prepared his exit, and engineered the physical space itself to buy himself precious seconds. Those seconds were enough for him to fire his single shot, fight briefly with an officer inside the box, and leap to the stage below, shouting his infamous Latin phrase before disappearing into the night. 7. The peephole in Lincoln's box. That barricade wasn't Booth's only preparation. Earlier in the day, before anyone had arrived for the evening's performance, Booth slipped into the empty theater and bored a small hole through the door of the presidential box. Some accounts say he used a gimlet, others a knife, but the purpose was the same either way. He wanted a clear line of sight into the box before committing to his plan. That peephole let him confirm exactly where Lincoln was seated without needing to open the door and risk being seen or stopped. It's a small detail, but it tells us something important about Booth's mindset that night. He wasn't gambling on chance or improvising in the moment. He was methodically eliminating uncertainty, checking his target's position like a hunter confirming a shot before pulling the trigger. Historians researching Ford's Theater in the decades since have pointed to this hole as physical evidence of just how calculated the assassination truly was. It wasn't rage boiling over in an instant. It was patience, planning, and a disturbing attention to detail. And speaking of details that reveal just how ordinary the evening seemed right up until it wasn't, let's talk about what Lincoln was actually watching when Booth peered through that hole. 8. Our American Cousin. The president and his wife had gone to Ford's Theater that night to see a popular comedy called Our American Cousin. It was a light-hearted, somewhat silly play about an awkward American visiting British relatives, full of exaggerated characters and slapstick humor. Not exactly the setting anyone would associate with one of the darkest nights in American history. Lincoln reportedly needed the distraction. The Civil War had just ended days earlier with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and the president was said to be in good spirits, finally allowing himself to relax after 4 grueling years. Friends who saw him that evening described him as unusually cheerful, laughing along with the audience, enjoying a rare night where the weight of the nation wasn't pressing directly on his shoulders. It's almost unbearably poignant looking back now, knowing what was coming. A man who had guided the country through its bloodiest chapter, finally exhaling for one evening at the theater, watching a forgettable comedy, completely unaware that a peephole had already been drilled into the door behind him. And speaking of that comedy, one particular line in the script would end up playing a far darker role than its writers ever intended. 9. The play's loud laugh line. Booth didn't fire at just any random moment. He waited for a specific line in the play, delivered by the character Asa Trenchard, that reliably produced one of the biggest laughs of the night. The line was something to the effect of calling another character a sockdologizing old man trap, a nonsense insult that always landed well with audiences. Booth knew the play. He'd performed on stages across the country himself and likely understood its rhythms well enough to predict exactly when the loudest reaction would come. That laughter, rolling through the packed theater, provided cover for the sound of a single pistol shot. It's a chilling piece of premeditation, using a stranger's comedic timing as camouflage for murder. When the shot rang out, some audience members initially assumed it was part of the show, a sound effect or a prop gun used for comic effect. That confusion cost precious seconds, time Booth used to fight briefly inside the box before leaping to the stage below. The theater itself, in a strange way, unknowingly participated in its own tragedy, laughing right up until the moment everything changed. And speaking of people inside that box who had no idea what was coming, Lincoln and his wife weren't alone that night. 10. Lincoln's evening guests. The Lincolns had actually invited several other couples to join them that night before settling on their final guests. General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia were the first choice, but they declined, reportedly because Julia Grant had no interest in spending an evening with Mary Lincoln, whose temperament had a reputation for being difficult. That decision likely saved Grant's life, since some historians believe the broader conspiracy originally intended to target him as well. After several other invitations were turned down, the Lincolns settled on a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, the daughter of a New York senator. It was a fairly last-minute arrangement, filling seats that were never supposed to be theirs. Rathbone and Harris had no reason to expect anything unusual that night beyond an enjoyable evening at the theater with the president. Instead, they found themselves thrust into one of history's most infamous moments, close enough to reach out and try to stop it, but not close enough to prevent what was already set irreversibly in motion. And speaking of the moments right before everything unraveled, Mary Lincoln herself left behind a small, haunting detail from earlier that evening. 11. Mary Lincoln's hand. Witnesses in the box that night recalled that just moments before the gunshot, Mary Lincoln had reached over and taken her husband's hand, leaning close and asking him something playful about what Clara Harris might think of them holding hands so openly in public. Lincoln reportedly smiled and told her not to worry about it. It's a small, tender, almost mundane exchange, the kind of quiet affection shared between any long-married couple settling into an evening out. But it's also devastating in hindsight, a final ordinary moment frozen just before catastrophe. Mary would later struggle for the rest of her life with the trauma of that night, reportedly never fully recovering from watching her husband shot beside her while their hands were still touching. She spent her final years dealing with profound grief and mental health struggles that some biographers connect directly back to that single instant. It's a reminder that behind the sweeping historical narrative of assassination and national mourning, there was also just a wife holding her husband's hand, unaware that within seconds, everything about her life would change forever. And speaking of people who tried desperately to change what was happening in that box, one man paid a heavy physical price for his effort. 12. Rathbone's wound. When Booth fired his shot and Lincoln slumped forward, Major Henry Rathbone immediately lunged at him, trying to grab and restrain the assassin before he could escape the box. Booth responded by slashing at Rathbone with a knife, cutting deep into his arm, severing muscle and narrowly missing an artery. Despite the wound, Rathbone kept fighting, trying to hold Booth back even as blood poured down his sleeve. Booth broke free, leapt over the railing to the stage below, and made his escape through the back of the theater. Rathbone, meanwhile, was left bleeding heavily, and by some accounts he nearly lost consciousness before help arrived. The physical wound eventually healed, but many historians believe the psychological toll never did. Rathbone reportedly struggled for years afterward with guilt over failing to stop the assassination, and his mental health deteriorated significantly over the following decades. Some accounts suggest the trauma of that night quietly haunted him until his own life ended in tragedy years later. It's a sobering footnote to an already devastating night, a reminder that Booth's single bullet sent shockwaves far beyond the presidential box itself, permanently altering the lives of everyone who happened to be sitting nearby that evening. 13. Booth's broken leg. As Booth leapt from the presidential box down to the stage, his spur caught on the flag draped across the railing, twisting his body awkwardly as he fell. He landed hard, and most accounts agree he fractured his left fibula in the process, though the details of exactly how it happened have never been fully settled. Some witnesses claimed he stumbled but seemed otherwise fine as he shouted his now infamous line and dashed off stage. Others insisted he limped visibly, clearly in pain, as he made his way toward the back exit, where a horse was waiting. Booth himself later wrote in his diary that he broke the bone during the jump, but a few historians have floated an alternate theory over the years, suggesting the injury may have actually happened later that night, when his horse stumbled during the escape into Maryland. There's no way to know for certain which version is accurate. What we do know is that the broken leg slowed him down considerably in the days that followed, forcing him to rely on accomplices for help and eventually leading him to the home of a doctor who would soon find himself swept into the investigation. And speaking of the medical response that night, one very young doctor found himself thrust into the middle of history almost by accident. 14. Dr. Charles Leal. Sitting in the audience that night was a 23-year-old Army surgeon named Charles Leal, who had only graduated medical school a few weeks earlier. When the shot rang out and chaos erupted, Leal pushed his way toward the presidential box and was the first physician to reach Lincoln's side. He found the president slumped forward, barely breathing, and began examining him in the dim, crowded box. Leal initially searched for a knife wound, assuming Rathbone's bleeding arm was the primary injury, before locating the small bullet hole behind Lincoln's left ear. Recognizing the wound was fatal, Leal reportedly worked to clear an airway and keep Lincoln breathing, understanding there was little more medicine could do. His calm, methodical actions in those first chaotic minutes have been credited with keeping Lincoln alive long enough to be moved. Leal stayed by Lincoln's side for the rest of the night, holding his hand at times, a small act of comfort in the face of an unwinnable situation. He later described the experience as one that shaped the rest of his career and his life. A young surgeon at the very start of his profession found himself present for its most historically weighty night. And speaking of where Lincoln was taken next, the destination itself was almost an accident of geography. 15. The Peterson House. With Lincoln unconscious and clearly not fit to be moved back to the White House, those attending him needed somewhere closer to bring him. Someone reportedly stepped outside Ford's Theater and noticed a man standing in the doorway of a boarding house directly across the street, gesturing for them to bring the president inside. That boarding house belonged to William Peterson, a tailor, and it happened to have a small back bedroom available. Lincoln was carried carefully across 10th Street, through the front door and into that modest room, which quickly filled with doctors, cabinet officials, and eventually a stream of visitors hoping for any update. It was an ordinary home suddenly transformed into the center of national attention, its owners largely bystanders to a historical event, unfolding under their own roof. The Peterson house had no special connection to Lincoln or his administration. It simply happened to be the nearest available space when time mattered most. Today, the room where Lincoln spent his final hours has been preserved as a historic site, drawing visitors who want to stand in the space where the president's story came to its quiet, devastating end. And speaking of that small back room, it presented an immediate and almost absurd problem. 16. A bed too short. Lincoln stood at roughly 6'4", remarkably tall for his era, and the modest bed available in the Peterson house's back bedroom was nowhere near long enough to accommodate him. When attendants tried to lay him down normally, his feet extended well past the footboard. Rather than risk further injury by forcing him into an unnatural position, doctors made the decision to lay Lincoln diagonally across the mattress, his head near one corner and his legs stretched toward the opposite side. It's a strange, almost darkly comic detail amid such a somber scene, The President of the United States mortally wounded, forced into an undignified diagonal position simply because no one had a bed built for a man his size. Witnesses in the room that night described the awkward arrangement as one more small indignity layered onto an already unbearable situation. Lincoln remained in that position for the rest of the night as doctors monitored his fading vital signs. The bed itself has since become something of a historical artifact, a reminder that even the most solemn moments in history often come wrapped in small, very human inconveniences. And speaking of the people managing that room throughout the night, one man effectively took charge of the entire government from inside it. 17. Stanton's War Room. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived at the Peterson House within the hour and quickly transformed a nearby room into a makeshift command center. With the president incapacitated and the vice president's whereabouts still uncertain amid fears of a broader conspiracy, Stanton essentially ran the federal government from that cramped space for several hours. He issued orders, questioned witnesses, dispatched telegrams, and began coordinating the manhunt for Booth almost immediately. Stanton's calm, authoritative presence that night led some historians to credit him with preventing further panic or chaos in Washington during a moment when no one knew if the attack on Lincoln was an isolated act or the opening move of a larger plot. He interviewed people present at Ford's Theater, took statements, and started assembling what would become the foundation of the assassination investigation before Lincoln had even died. Some historians have noted the irony that the most organized, decisive figure that night wasn't stationed at the White House or the War Department, but crammed into a rented boarding house bedroom, directing history from a borrowed chair. And speaking of history unfolding in that house, the final hours ticked by slowly, ending in a moment the entire nation had been dreading since the shot was fired. 18. Lincoln's final morning. Lincoln never regained consciousness after being shot. Throughout the night, doctors monitored his weakening pulse and shallow breathing, offering little more than quiet observation, since there was nothing more medicine of the time could do for a wound like his. Cabinet members, family friends, and Mary Lincoln herself moved in and out of the small room, watching the president's condition steadily decline. By early morning, his breathing had become increasingly labored, and those gathered understood the end was near. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died, roughly 9 hours after being shot. Stanton, standing at his bedside, is often quoted as saying, "Now he belongs to the ages," though some historians debate the exact wording and whether he said it at that precise moment. Word spread quickly through Washington and then across the country, plunging a nation that had just begun celebrating the war's end into sudden, disorienting grief. Lincoln had guided the country through its most devastating chapter, only to be taken from it within days of finally seeing peace. And speaking of what happened next, the search for the man responsible was only just beginning. 19. Booth's diary. During the 12 days he spent on the run after the assassination, Booth kept a small red pocket diary, scribbling entries as he hid in barns and swamps across Maryland and Virginia. In it, he defended his actions in dramatic, almost theatrical language, comparing himself to Brutus and insisting history would vindicate him for killing what he saw as a tyrant. He wrote about feeling betrayed, noting with apparent shock that newspapers were calling him a villain rather than a hero. The diary offers a rare, unfiltered look into the mind of a man convinced he'd performed a noble act even as the manhunt closed in around him. Investigators found the diary on his body after he was killed, and it quickly became one of the most studied documents connected to the assassination. Some pages had reportedly gone missing by the time it reached official custody, fueling decades of speculation about whether entries were removed to protect other parties. Historians still debate what those missing pages might have contained, though no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. What remains paints a portrait of a man isolated, unraveling, and clinging to a narrative of martyrdom. And speaking of where that narrative finally ran out of road, Booth's flight came to an end at a quiet Virginia farm. 20. The Garrett farmhouse. After days of hiding and moving under cover of darkness, Booth and his companion David Harold arrived at the farm of Richard Garrett in rural Virginia, presenting themselves as Confederate soldiers making their way home. The Garrett family, unaware of who they were actually sheltering, allowed the two men to stay, eventually offering them space in a tobacco barn on the property. Federal cavalry, tracking leads for nearly 2 weeks, finally caught up with them there in the early hours of April 26, 1865. Troops surrounded the barn, demanding the men surrender. Harold gave himself up fairly quickly, but Booth reportedly refused, insisting he would not be taken alive and daring the soldiers outside to fight him directly. With negotiations going nowhere, officers ordered the barn set ablaze, hoping the fire would force Booth out into the open. Flames began climbing the wooden structure while Booth remained inside, his silhouette visible through the gaps in the boards as troops watched from a distance. It was a tense, drawn-out standoff, the culmination of the largest manhunt in American history to that point, unfolding in a modest tobacco barn on a farm most Americans had never heard of. And speaking of what happened as those flames spread, one soldier's decision would end the chase for good. 21. Boston Corbett shot. As the Garrett barn burned around him, Sergeant Boston Corbett, a Union cavalryman known for his intense religious devotion, positioned himself near a gap in the barn wall. Officers on scene had given clear orders to take Booth alive if at all possible, hoping to question him about a potential wider conspiracy. Corbett later claimed he saw Booth raising a weapon inside the smoke-filled barn and believed he had no choice but to fire in defense. He shot Booth through a gap in the boards, the bullet striking him in the neck, severing his spinal cord and leaving him paralyzed. Soldiers pulled him from the burning structure and laid him on the farmhouse porch, where he lingered for several hours before dying. His last reported words were a request to have his hands lifted so he could see them, followed by the whispered phrase, "Useless, useless." Corbett was briefly reprimanded for disobeying orders, though the punishment amounted to little more than a formality, and he became something of a minor celebrity for ending the manhunt. Whether Booth truly posed a threat in that moment or Corbett acted impulsively remains debated by historians to this day. And speaking of the investigation that followed Booth's death, attention quickly turned to the people who had helped him. 22. The Booth conspirators trial. In the weeks after the assassination, federal authorities arrested a group of people believed to have assisted Booth in planning or carrying out the plot. 8 defendants ultimately stood trial before a military commission rather than a civilian court, a decision that remains controversial among historians who question whether it denied the accused fair constitutional protections. The proceedings were fast, tightly controlled, and heavily influenced by the emotional aftermath of Lincoln's death, with public sentiment leaving little room for sympathy toward anyone connected to Booth. Evidence presented ranged from solid to circumstantial, and some historians argue certain defendants were swept up more by association than clear proof of involvement. The commission ultimately convicted all 8, handing down sentences that ranged from lengthy imprisonment to execution. Critics at the time and since have questioned whether the military tribunal format was chosen specifically to secure convictions more efficiently than a traditional jury trial might have allowed. The trial remains a frequently studied example of how national trauma can shape the machinery of justice in ways that don't always align neatly with due process. And speaking of one defendant whose home became central to the case, her story remains one of the trial's most debated chapters. 23. Mary Surratt's boarding house. Mary Surratt ran a boarding house in Washington, D.C. that investigators discovered had served as a meeting place for Booth and several of his co-conspirators in the months leading up to the assassination. Her son John Surratt was believed to be deeply involved in the broader plot, though he managed to flee the country before authorities could arrest him. Mary herself was charged with conspiracy, largely based on testimony claiming she had knowingly hosted planning meetings and passed along messages related to the plot. The evidence against her was and remains a subject of historical debate, with some records suggesting the testimony used to convict her was inconsistent or possibly coerced. Despite this, the military commission found her guilty and sentenced her to death, making her the first woman executed by the federal government. Appeals for clemency, including a petition reportedly signed by several commission members themselves, failed to change the outcome. She was hanged on July 7, 1865, alongside 3 other conspirators. Historians still argue over whether Mary Surratt was a knowing participant in the plot, or simply a woman punished for her son's actions and her own poor timing in choosing who rented rooms in her home. And speaking of the nation processing this loss, one final journey helped Americans say goodbye. 24. The Lincoln funeral train. Following his death, Lincoln's body began an extraordinary journey home, traveling by train nearly 1,700 miles from Washington, D.C. to his final resting place in Springfield, Illinois. The route passed through cities including Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, with the train stopping repeatedly so mourners could view the president's casket. Millions of Americans lined the tracks along the way, some traveling great distances just to catch a brief glimpse of the passing train as it moved slowly through the countryside. In several major cities, the casket was removed for public viewings inside government buildings, drawing lines of mourners stretching for blocks. The journey took nearly 3 weeks, transforming into one continuous rolling funeral procession unlike anything the country had seen before. It served as a shared nationwide moment of grief, allowing ordinary citizens who never met Lincoln to feel some small connection to his passing. When the train finally reached Springfield, Lincoln was laid to rest, not far from where his political career had first begun decades earlier. The funeral train remains one of the most striking symbols of how deeply his death affected the nation, turning private mourning into a massive, shared public ritual. 25. Lincoln's White House dream. According to accounts later shared by his wife Mary and biographer Ward Hill Leman, Lincoln described a troubling dream just days before his assassination. In it, he wandered through the White House hearing muffled sobbing, eventually finding a corpse laid out in the East Room, guarded by soldiers, with mourners weeping around it. When Lincoln asked who had died, he was reportedly told the president. He was killed by an assassin. He apparently woke up disturbed and shared the dream with his wife and close associates, though he tried to downplay its significance at the time. Mary Lincoln later said the story haunted her, especially given how quickly reality seemed to mirror it. It's worth noting this account comes secondhand, filtered through people writing about it after the assassination had already occurred, which makes the story difficult to verify and easy to embellish in hindsight. Human memory has a way of reshaping the past once we know how things turned out. Still, whether it was genuine premonition, ordinary anxiety, or a story polished after the fact, it remains one of the eerier footnotes tied to Lincoln's final days. And speaking of unexpected paths to the presidency, our next assassinated president didn't even want the job in the first place. 26. Garfield's undeclared candidacy. James Garfield arrived at the 1880 Republican National Convention in Chicago, not as a candidate for president, but as a delegate supporting another man entirely, John Sherman. Garfield gave the speech nominating Sherman, and by most accounts delivered it with skill and passion, which ironically drew attention toward himself rather than away from it. He hadn't campaigned, hadn't lobbied delegates, and hadn't publicly expressed any interest in the nomination. As the convention dragged into gridlock between competing factions, Garfield's name began appearing on ballots almost organically, gaining momentum he neither sought nor initially welcomed. He reportedly objected on the convention floor, insisting he hadn't consented to being considered, but the momentum continued regardless. It's a strange scenario to imagine today, a man becoming a serious contender for the highest office in the country, almost by accident, through sheer political deadlock rather than ambition. Some historians see this as a testament to Garfield's reputation for integrity, a candidate untangled from petty deal-making. Others suggest it simply reflects how chaotic and transactional convention politics were at the time. Either way, Garfield's reluctant rise set the stage for one of the more unusual nomination stories in American history. And speaking of that chaotic convention, the process of actually choosing him took far longer than anyone expected. 27. The 36th ballot. The 1880 Republican Convention became a grinding test of endurance, splitting largely between supporters of former President Ulysses S. Grant, who wanted a third term, and backers of Senator James Blaine. Neither faction could secure enough votes to win outright, and neither showed any sign of budging. Ballot after ballot passed with no resolution, delegates growing exhausted, tempers fraying, and the convention hall filling with the kind of tense stalemate energy that makes for great historical footnotes and miserable in-person experiences. Garfield's name, initially a minor factor, slowly started gaining support as a compromise option, someone neither faction had strong objections to. By the 34th ballot, his numbers were climbing noticeably. By the 36th ballot, delegates finally consolidated behind him, making him the surprise nominee of a party that had spent days unable to agree on literally anyone else. It's a reminder that presidential nominations weren't always neat, scripted coronations. They were sometimes messy, unpredictable negotiations decided through sheer exhaustion. Garfield went on to win the general election that fall, entering office as a compromise candidate rather than a triumphant frontrunner. And speaking of unexpected figures drawn into political drama, one particular man believed he deserved special credit for that victory. 28. Charles Guiteau's speech. Charles Guiteau, the man who would later assassinate Garfield, believed he had played a significant role in getting him elected. During the 1880 campaign, Guiteau wrote and distributed a speech titled Garfield versus Hancock, intended to rally support for the Republican ticket. By most contemporary accounts, the speech was poorly written, disorganized, and barely noticed by anyone involved in the actual campaign. Still, Guiteau convinced himself it had been instrumental in Garfield's narrow victory, imagining his words had swayed voters in some meaningful way. This wasn't an isolated moment of confidence. It fit a broader pattern of grandiose thinking that friends and family had observed in Guiteau for years. He genuinely believed his contribution warranted recognition and, more importantly in his mind, a reward. This disconnect between Guiteau's self-perception and reality would only grow more consequential in the months that followed. Historians and mental health experts examining the case later have pointed to this episode as an early sign of the delusional thinking that would eventually turn deadly. It's a strange, unsettling thread running through the story. A man convinced he'd done something heroic, building expectations that reality had no intention of fulfilling. And speaking of those expectations, Guiteau wasn't shy about pursuing what he believed he was owed. 29. Guiteau's office seeking. After Garfield's inauguration, Charles Guiteau began a persistent campaign to secure a diplomatic appointment, specifically requesting a consulship in either Vienna or Paris, despite having no relevant qualifications, experience, or credentials whatsoever. This wasn't entirely unusual for the era. The spoils system meant government jobs were often handed out based on political favors and connections rather than merit, and hopeful applicants frequently showed up at government offices hoping for a break. Guiteau, however, took this practice to an obsessive extreme. He repeatedly visited the White House and State Department, sometimes daily, trying to speak directly with officials, including Garfield himself and Secretary of State James Blaine. He was consistently turned away, told plainly and repeatedly that he would not be receiving any appointment. Rather than accepting this rejection, Guiteau grew increasingly fixated, interpreting the refusals as personal betrayals rather than routine denials faced by countless other unqualified applicants. His mental state, already fragile by most accounts from those who knew him, seemed to deteriorate further with each dismissal. What began as an ordinary, if delusional, pursuit of political patronage slowly transformed into something far darker. And speaking of patronage disputes, shaping the atmosphere around Garfield's presidency, tensions within his own party were creating problems long before Guiteau ever fired a shot. 30. The Stalwart Dispute. Garfield's presidency was immediately complicated by a bitter feud with Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, a powerful leader of the Republican faction known as the Stalwarts, who strongly favored the traditional patronage system. Conkling expected significant influence over federal appointments, particularly in New York, where he considered such positions his rightful domain to distribute among loyal supporters. Garfield, aligned more with reform-minded Republicans skeptical of unchecked patronage, resisted this pressure, appointing officials Conkling hadn't approved. The conflict escalated publicly, with Conkling and a fellow senator resigning in protest, expecting state legislators to reappoint them as a show of support. Instead, they were humiliated when the legislature declined, effectively ending Conkling's political career. This entire dispute over patronage and political loyalty created a charged atmosphere in Washington, one where frustrated office seekers like Guiteau felt increasingly justified in their grievances. Guiteau himself identified as a stalwart, and later claimed his assassination of Garfield was meant to help unify the party by elevating Vice President Chester Arthur, a Conkling ally, to the presidency. Whether that reasoning reflected genuine political conviction or simply post hoc justification for a delusional act remains debated among historians. Either way, the ordinary machinery of political patronage had quietly set the stage for tragedy. 31. The New York Custom House. At the heart of the feud between Garfield and Senator Roscoe Conkling sat one particularly lucrative prize: control over the New York Custom House. This wasn't some minor bureaucratic office. It was one of the most powerful patronage positions in the entire federal government, overseeing enormous amounts of trade revenue and employing hundreds of workers who owed their jobs to whoever ran it. Conkling had spent years placing loyalists there, building a political machine funded by custom house jobs and favors. When Garfield appointed his own choice to lead it, someone outside Conkling's control, it wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was a direct challenge to the entire stalwart power structure in New York. Conkling saw it as a betrayal of the unwritten rules governing patronage politics, rules that had shaped American governance for decades. The resulting standoff consumed weeks of Garfield's early presidency, turning what should have been routine administration into a very public power struggle. It's easy to forget how much of 19th century politics revolved around who controlled which government office, but the Custom House fight shows just how high the stakes could get. And speaking of Garfield trying to escape political pressure for a while, he had personal plans that never came to pass. 32. Garfield's train plans. By the summer of 1881, Garfield was reportedly looking forward to something fairly ordinary, a vacation. He planned to travel to New England, partly for rest and partly to visit his alma mater, Williams College, where he hoped to reconnect with old friends and perhaps enjoy a brief escape from the grinding political battles consuming his first months in office. Accounts suggest he was in good spirits that morning, looking forward to time away from Washington's constant demands. His wife Lucretia had been recovering from a serious illness earlier that year, and the trip was also meant to help her regain strength in a quieter setting away from the capital. Garfield made his way to the train station with Secretary of State James Blaine, unaware that his plans for rest and reconnection were about to be violently interrupted. It's one of those small human details that gets easily overshadowed by the larger historical event that followed, a president simply trying to take a break, much like anyone else might. And speaking of that fateful morning, the location where those plans fell apart has its own place in this story. 33. Baltimore and Potomac Station. The shooting itself took place at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., a bustling hub where Garfield was preparing to board a train for his New England trip. Charles Guiteau had been tracking Garfield's movements for weeks, learning of his travel plans through newspaper reports, which were far more detailed about presidential schedules back then than security experts today would ever recommend. Guiteau arrived at the station ahead of time, waiting calmly among the crowd of ordinary travelers going about their day. When Garfield walked through the station with Secretary Blaine, Guiteau approached from behind and fired twice at close range. The public setting meant there were numerous witnesses, adding to the shock and immediacy with which news of the shooting spread. Unlike more secluded assassination attempts in history, this one unfolded in a crowded, everyday space, a train station full of people simply trying to travel, suddenly transformed into the scene of a national tragedy. It's a stark reminder of how little separated presidents from the public in that era. And speaking of that station, its own story didn't end there either. 34. The station's later demolition. The Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, the site of Garfield's shooting, didn't remain standing as some kind of solemn historical landmark. Instead, it continued operating as an active train station for years afterward, carrying passengers through the same halls where a president had been shot. Eventually, in 1908, the building was demolished entirely, making way for the construction of a new, larger structure, Union Station, which still serves Washington, D.C. today. There's something oddly fitting, or perhaps unsettling, about how thoroughly the physical evidence of the event was erased, paved over by the ordinary demands of a growing city and its ever-expanding transportation needs. No preserved plaque marks the exact spot where Garfield fell. No memorial waiting room reminds travelers of what happened there. It's a quiet illustration of how history sometimes gets literally built over, leaving only written accounts and old photographs to preserve what occurred. Union Station remains one of the busiest transit hubs in the country, its passengers largely unaware they're walking near ground that once held such significance. And speaking of people present at that fateful moment, one man in particular found himself unexpectedly close to the violence. 35. Secretary Blaine at the station. Secretary of State James G. Blaine was walking alongside Garfield through the station when Guiteau opened fire, making him one of the closest witnesses to the entire event. Blaine and Garfield were reportedly in the middle of relaxed conversation Discussing the upcoming trip, when the first shot rang out, by most accounts, Blaine froze for a moment in stunned confusion before rushing to Garfield's side as chaos erupted around them. Given Blaine's own turbulent political history, including his bitter rivalry with the stalwarts in Conkling's faction, his presence at the shooting added an eerie layer to an already tense political atmosphere. Some later speculated, without much real evidence, about whether political enemies might have played some hidden role, though investigations consistently pointed to Guiteau acting entirely alone. Blaine would go on to serve as Secretary of State again under later administrations, his career surviving this traumatic moment relatively intact. It's a strange footnote, a powerful political figure standing mere feet away from a president being shot, forced to witness firsthand the violent unraveling of the administration he'd just begun serving. And speaking of details surrounding that fatal moment, even Guiteau's choice of weapon carried an odd, unsettling logic. 36. Guiteau's ivory-handled revolver. When Charles Guiteau purchased the revolver he would use to shoot Garfield, he reportedly gave careful thought to its appearance, not just its function. He specifically chose a model with an ivory handle, apparently believing it would look more impressive if it ended up displayed in a museum someday, a chilling detail that speaks volumes about his grandiose, delusional thinking. Guiteau seemed less concerned with practical considerations and more focused on how the weapon, and by extension his own act, would be remembered by history. He reportedly couldn't quite afford the ivory-handled version at first and had to borrow money to make the purchase, prioritizing the gun's aesthetic value over almost anything else. This small, strange detail fits into the broader pattern of Guiteau's behavior leading up to the assassination. Someone consumed by fantasies of historical significance and personal importance far removed from reality. It's an unsettling glimpse into the mind of a man who saw himself as a major historical figure in the making, rather than someone about to commit a devastating act of violence. The revolver itself did eventually end up preserved, a strange artifact tied to one of the darker chapters of American presidential history. 37. The bullet that missed. When Charles Guiteau fired at President Garfield in that crowded train station, most people assume both shots struck their target with equal severity. That's not quite what happened. The first bullet only grazed Garfield's arm, a wound that under normal circumstances might have kept him laid up for a few days at most, nothing life-threatening on its own. It was the second shot that did the real damage, striking Garfield in the back and lodging somewhere inside his body, exactly where doctors couldn't quite agree. Had only the first shot connected, history might remember Guiteau as a failed, forgotten assassin rather than the man who killed a president. Instead, that second bullet set off an 11-week medical ordeal that arguably did more damage than the gunshot itself. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment. Garfield wasn't killed instantly, or even quickly. He survived the initial violence only to face a slower, more agonizing decline at the hands of the very people trying to save him. And speaking of those people, the doctor who took charge of Garfield's care brought his own set of serious problems to the sick room. 38. Dr. Willard Bliss. In the chaos following the shooting, Dr. D. Willard Bliss quickly took charge of Garfield's medical care, largely through sheer assertiveness rather than any official appointment. Bliss had treated Garfield once before, years earlier during the Civil War, and used that prior connection to insert himself as the lead physician overseeing the president's recovery. The trouble was, Bliss clung to outdated medical practices even as newer, safer techniques were becoming available elsewhere. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods had already gained traction in parts of Europe, yet Bliss showed little interest in adopting them. He believed, like many American doctors of his generation, that infection resulted from bad air rather than germs, a theory that would prove disastrous for his patient. Bliss essentially controlled access to Garfield, limiting other doctors' involvement, and making most of the critical decisions himself. Historians looking back on the case often point to Bliss's outdated methods as a significant factor in Garfield's prolonged suffering. It's one of those uncomfortable historical truths. Sometimes the person meant to help ends up causing more harm through simple stubbornness and bad timing. And unfortunately, Bliss's approach to treatment only got worse from there. 39. Unsterilized probing. Rather than leaving the bullet alone, once it became clear it wasn't an immediate threat, Garfield's doctors, led by Bliss, spent weeks trying to locate and remove it. The problem was how they went about the search. doctors repeatedly inserted unwashed fingers and unsterilized metal probes directly into Garfield's wound, searching blindly for the bullet's location. Antiseptic surgical practices were essentially ignored, despite growing evidence elsewhere in the medical world supporting their use. Each probing attempt introduced new bacteria into Garfield's body, creating infection after infection in a wound that might have healed on its own if simply left undisturbed. Garfield's condition steadily worsened throughout the summer, his body racked by fevers and abscesses that were arguably caused more by his treatment than his injury. Modern doctors looking back on the case generally agree that Garfield likely would have survived if his physicians had simply left the bullet in place and kept the wound clean. Instead, he suffered through months of preventable agony. It stands as one of medicine's more haunting what-ifs. A president possibly killed less by an assassin's bullet than by the well-intentioned but deeply flawed medical care meant to save him. And speaking of attempts to locate that stubborn bullet, one came from a rather unexpected source. 40. Alexander Graham Bell's detector. As Garfield's doctors struggled to locate the bullet lodged somewhere in his body, an unlikely figure stepped in to help: inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Best known for inventing the telephone just a few years earlier, Bell turned his attention to building a device that could detect metal inside the human body using induction balance technology. The idea was innovative for its time, essentially an early prototype of what we'd now recognize as a metal detector. Bell worked urgently, driven by genuine concern for the president and confidence in his own scientific abilities. He tested the device successfully on other patients with metal fragments before bringing it to Garfield's sick room, hopeful it might finally reveal the bullet's exact location without further invasive probing. It was a remarkable moment, cutting-edge science, attempting to solve a medical mystery that traditional methods had failed to address. Bell's device represented real ingenuity and a serious attempt to apply new technology towards saving the president's life. Unfortunately, despite his best efforts and careful preparation, the results in Garfield's actual examination turned out far less conclusive than hoped. And that disappointing outcome had a very specific, almost absurd cause. 41. The metal bed frame problem. When Alexander Graham Bell brought his induction balance device to test on President Garfield, he ran into an unexpected complication that had nothing to do with the technology itself. Garfield happened to be lying on a bed with metal springs, and those springs interfered significantly with the device's readings. Bell's detector picked up signals from the metal frame surrounding Garfield, rather than clearly isolating any bullet fragment inside his body. The resulting readings were confusing and inconsistent, leaving Bell frustrated by a problem he hadn't anticipated. He requested a bed without metal components for a more accurate test, but by most accounts, the interference issue was never fully resolved during his examinations. Some historians suggest Bell may have actually detected something near the correct location, but the surrounding metal made it impossible to know for certain. It's a strange twist, cutting-edge science undone not by its own flaws, but by simple hospital furniture nobody thought to consider beforehand. Garfield's bullet was ultimately never removed during his lifetime, and wasn't definitively located until his autopsy. And through all these failed attempts and mounting frustrations, Garfield remained confined to increasingly difficult surroundings. 42. The White House sick room. For weeks after the shooting, Garfield remained in the White House, confined to a room hastily converted into a makeshift medical ward. Washington's brutal summer heat made his suffering even worse, with temperatures inside the White House climbing to unbearable levels. Engineers eventually built a crude air conditioning system specifically for Garfield's room, using fans blowing air over ice, one of the earliest known attempts at climate control in the building's history. Despite these efforts, conditions remained difficult, and Garfield's health continued declining as infections spread through his weakened body. The sick room became the center of national attention, with newspapers publishing regular updates on his condition and Americans anxiously following his prognosis day by day. Eventually, doctors decided to move Garfield away from Washington entirely, hoping a change in environment might aid his recovery. But for those crucial weeks, the White House itself became something between a hospital and a death watch, transforming the seat of American power into a place defined by suffering and uncertainty. It's a striking image, the nation's highest office reduced to a sick room, its occupant fighting for his life while the machinery of government continued on largely without him. 43. The Long Branch Cottage. By early September, Garfield's doctors had run out of ideas for how to help him in Washington, so they decided a change of scenery might succeed where medicine had failed. Garfield was moved to a cottage in Elberon, New Jersey, near Long Branch, on the theory that fresh ocean air might revive him where the sweltering, infection-ridden air of the White House had not. It sounds almost quaint by modern standards, the idea that sea breezes could counteract weeks of untreated infection and internal damage, but doctors at the time genuinely believed environment played a major role in recovery. The move itself was treated as a delicate operation, with careful planning around how to transport a dying president without worsening his condition. Garfield was carried gently from the White House to a train, and from there toward the coast, in what became one of the more logistically complicated journeys in presidential history. It reflected both the desperation of his doctors and the limits of what medicine could offer at the time. Whether the sea air genuinely helped is impossible to say, but it likely offered Garfield a measure of comfort in his final days that Washington no longer could. And getting him to that cottage required an engineering effort almost as remarkable as the medical one. 44. The Emergency Railroad Spur. Moving a dying president comfortably wasn't as simple as booking a train ticket, so when officials decided Garfield should recover by the sea, they discovered the existing railway didn't actually reach close enough to the cottage in Elberon. Rather than accept that inconvenience, workers built an entirely new spur of track literally overnight, extending the line directly toward the property where Garfield would stay. It was an extraordinary feat of rapid construction, driven by urgency and a desire to spare the president any unnecessary jostling or delay. Reports from the time described laborers working through the night, laying rail under lantern light so that Garfield's train could glide almost directly to his door the next morning. The effort succeeded, and Garfield was transported with about as much gentleness as 1881 technology allowed, arriving at the cottage without the added strain of a rough carriage ride from a distant station. It's a striking example of how much energy and resources were poured into caring for Garfield once it became clear he might not survive, even as the medical care he received remained deeply flawed by modern standards. The nation, quite literally, built new infrastructure just to ease his final days. Yet even fresh air and careful transport could only do so much for what came next. 45. Garfield's 79-day ordeal. When Charles Guiteau fired those 2 shots in July of 1881, Garfield didn't die immediately, nor did he die within days as many assassination victims historically have. Instead, he lingered for 79 agonizing days, slipping in and out of fevers, enduring repeated medical interventions, and losing weight dramatically as infection spread through his body. This lengthy decline meant the nation experienced an extended period of uncertainty, glued to newspaper updates that oscillated between cautious hope and grim prognosis. Cabinet members and officials struggled with how to run the government during this strange limbo, since Garfield remained technically alive and in office, yet increasingly incapacitated. It raised uncomfortable questions about presidential succession that the Constitution at the time didn't clearly address, questions that wouldn't be fully resolved until the 25th Amendment nearly a century later. Garfield finally died on September 19, 1881, at the cottage in Elberon, succumbing not to the bullet itself but to the cascade of infections and complications that followed weeks of probing and neglect. His prolonged suffering left a lasting impression on the American public and on the medical community about just how dangerous well-intentioned but outdated treatment could be. What exactly killed him, though, wasn't entirely clear until doctors examined his body afterward. 46. The actual bullet location. After Garfield's death, an autopsy finally revealed what months of probing, guessing, and even Alexander Graham Bell's metal detector had failed to determine with any certainty. The bullet had traveled through Garfield's back and ultimately lodged near his pancreas, in a location that doctors during his life had never quite pinpointed correctly. Many of their invasive search efforts had actually focused on the wrong areas entirely, meaning the repeated unsterilized probing not only failed to find the bullet, but likely introduced infections nowhere near where it needed to. The autopsy findings confirmed what some modern doctors have long suspected, that the bullet itself, while serious, probably wouldn't have been fatal if left alone and the wound simply kept clean. Instead, it was the massive infection resulting from weeks of unsanitary medical intervention that caused Garfield's body to essentially poison itself internally. This revelation became a turning point of sorts for American medicine, adding weight to arguments in favor of adopting Joseph Lister's antiseptic techniques more broadly. Garfield's death, in that sense, ended up teaching the medical establishment a lesson his doctors had refused to learn while he was still alive. But while doctors reflected on what went wrong medically, the legal system turned its attention to the man who fired the shots in the first place. 47. Guiteau's insanity defense. When Charles Guiteau finally stood trial for Garfield's assassination, his defense strategy centered on the claim that he was legally insane at the time of the shooting and therefore not responsible for his actions. Guiteau's behavior throughout the trial did little to help his case, as he frequently interrupted proceedings, argued with his own attorneys, and delivered rambling statements insisting God had personally directed him to remove Garfield from office. He seemed to genuinely believe his actions were justified, even righteous, framing himself as an instrument of divine will rather than a common criminal. Medical experts at the time debated his mental state extensively, with some testifying that his erratic behavior and grandiose delusions suggested genuine mental illness. The jury, however, remained largely unconvinced, viewing his behavior as manipulative rather than evidence of true insanity. After deliberating, they found Guiteau guilty, rejecting the argument that his mental state absolved him of responsibility for Garfield's death. The trial itself became something of a spectacle, drawing widespread public attention and debate over how the legal system should handle claims of insanity in such serious cases. Guiteau's own explanation for his actions, though, went beyond claims of mental illness alone. 48. Guiteau's claimed motive. Throughout his trial, Guiteau insisted that his actions weren't rooted in personal hatred toward Garfield at all, but rather in his belief that removing the president served a greater political purpose. Guiteau had been a minor, largely unsuccessful figure within Republican political circles, convinced that his efforts had contributed meaningfully to Garfield's election victory. When he wasn't rewarded with a government appointment he felt he deserved, his resentment curdled into something far darker. He came to believe that Garfield's continued presidency threatened party unity, and that his death would somehow resolve internal Republican disputes for the greater good. In his mind, he wasn't committing murder so much as performing a kind of political service, however delusional that reasoning may have been. This claimed motive, tangled up with religious justification and political grievance, painted a picture of a man who saw himself as significant in ways reality simply didn't support. Historians still debate how much of his stated reasoning reflected genuine belief versus after-the-fact rationalization for an act driven largely by personal disappointment and instability. Whatever the true mixture of motives, Guiteau's actions set in motion consequences that extended far beyond politics, reshaping how Americans thought about presidential security, mental illness, and the fragile line between grievance and violence. 49. Garfield's civil service legacy. Guiteau's obsession with landing a government post wasn't just a personal grievance, it was a symptom of a much larger problem plaguing American politics at the time. The spoil system, where government jobs were handed out based on political loyalty rather than merit, had created armies of disappointed office seekers just like Guiteau, desperate men convinced they deserved a position simply because they'd supported the right candidate. Garfield's assassination, carried out by exactly this kind of frustrated patronage seeker, shocked the public into recognizing how dangerous this system had become. Newspapers and politicians alike began asking whether a nation should really allow its highest office to be endangered by disgruntled job hunters. Reform advocates who had been pushing for changes for years suddenly found their arguments taken far more seriously. Garfield himself, ironically, had shown some sympathy for reform before his death, though he'd stopped short of dismantling the system entirely. His assassination gave reformers the moral urgency they needed to finally push meaningful legislation through Congress. It's a strange legacy for a president who barely got the chance to govern, that his death did more for civil service reform than his life ever could have. 50. The Pendleton Act. 2 years after Garfield's death, Congress finally responded to the public outcry by passing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. The law established that certain federal jobs would be filled based on competitive exams and merit, rather than political connections or personal favors. It created the Civil Service Commission to oversee hiring and prevent the kind of patronage abuses that had fueled Guiteau's resentment in the first place. Only a small percentage of federal positions were covered under the act initially, but it set a precedent that would expand significantly over the following decades. Politicians who once relied heavily on patronage to reward loyal supporters suddenly found their power reshaped by this new system. Some historians argue the act wouldn't have passed nearly as quickly without Garfield's assassination serving as a stark, undeniable example of what the spoils system could produce. Others suggest reform was already gaining momentum regardless. Either way, the timing certainly didn't hurt the reformers' case. The Pendleton Act marked one of the first major steps toward the modern federal bureaucracy, transforming government jobs from political rewards into something resembling professional careers, a shift that continues to shape how Washington operates today. 51. McKinley's public handshakes. 2 decades after Garfield's assassination, President William McKinley developed something of a reputation for being remarkably accessible to the public. Despite growing concerns among his staff about presidential safety, McKinley insisted on personally greeting visitors, shaking hands with strangers at public events, and maintaining an open, approachable presence that many politicians of the era considered unusually risky. He believed that distancing himself from ordinary citizens would undermine the democratic image he wanted to project. Advisors occasionally urged more caution, pointing to the assassinations of Lincoln and Garfield as reasons for concern, but McKinley largely brushed these warnings aside. He seemed to view public accessibility as an essential part of the presidency, a way of remaining connected to the people he served, rather than retreating behind layers of security. This openness made him widely popular, seen by many as warm, down-to-earth, and genuinely engaged with everyday Americans. Whether this trust in the public was admirable or simply naive remains a matter of historical debate. What isn't debated is that this very habit of greeting strangers personally would eventually place him in a uniquely vulnerable position, one that history was about to test in the worst possible way. 52. The Pan American Exposition. In September of 1901, McKinley traveled to Buffalo, New York, to attend the Pan American Exposition, a massive World's Fair celebrating industrial and technological progress across the Americas. The event drew massive crowds, eager to see electric lights, new inventions, and exhibits showcasing the promise of the 20th century. McKinley, ever the accessible public figure, agreed to hold a public reception where ordinary citizens could line up and shake his hand personally. Security at these events was minimal by modern standards, largely consisting of a handful of guards positioned near the president rather than any serious screening process. Thousands of visitors passed through the reception line that day, and McKinley greeted each one with the same warmth he was known for throughout his presidency. It was exactly the kind of event his advisors had worried about, an open, crowded space where anyone could get close enough to shake the president's hand with little to no vetting beforehand. The optimism surrounding the exposition, all that talk of progress and modern innovation, made the setting feel safe, even celebratory. That sense of safety would prove tragically misplaced within moments of the reception beginning. 53. The Temple of Music. The presidential reception took place inside a building at the exposition known as the Temple of Music, an ornate structure designed to showcase the grandeur and artistic ambition of the fair itself. Grand columns, elaborate decorations, and sweeping architecture gave the space an almost ceremonial atmosphere, fitting for an event meant to celebrate progress and international goodwill. Long lines of visitors filed through the building, waiting for their brief moment to shake the president's hand. Guards stood nearby, but the atmosphere remained relaxed, more befitting a celebration than a security checkpoint. McKinley stood near the front, greeting each visitor individually just as he always had, seemingly unconcerned by the crowd pressing closer with every passing minute. The beauty and spectacle of the setting made it almost impossible to imagine violence occurring there, which perhaps made it all the more shocking when it did. Few could have predicted that this ornate hall, built to represent artistic achievement and cultural celebration, would soon become permanently linked to one of the darkest moments in American presidential history. Among the many hands McKinley shook that day was one belonging to a man who had come with an entirely different purpose in mind. 54. Leon Czolgosz's bandaged hand. Standing in line among the crowd of well-wishers was a man named Leon Czolgosz, who had wrapped a handkerchief around his right hand, giving the impression that he was simply nursing some minor injury. Underneath that innocent-looking bandage, however, he concealed a loaded revolver hidden in plain sight from the guards and fellow attendees around him. When his turn finally came to greet the president, Czolgosz extended his bandaged hand as though preparing for a routine handshake. Instead, he fired 2 shots directly into McKinley at close range before anyone could react. The crowd's initial confusion quickly turned to chaos as guards wrestled Czolgosz to the ground while McKinley staggered, wounded, still trying to process what had just happened. It was a chillingly simple method of concealment, exploiting the very openness and trust McKinley had insisted on throughout his presidency. Witnesses later described the shocking speed of the attack, how something so ordinary as a handshake had been turned into a moment of devastating violence. The exposition meant to celebrate progress and unity had instead become the backdrop for the 3rd presidential assassination in less than 40 years, raising urgent new questions about how leaders could ever truly be protected. 55. The receiving line warning. Before McKinley ever set foot in the Temple of Music, his personal secretary, George Cortelyou, had already tried to talk him out of the public reception entirely. Cortelyou reportedly canceled the event from the schedule not once but twice, worried that the open, crowded format was simply too dangerous for a sitting president. Each time, McKinley personally reinstated it, insisting that meeting the public was worth the risk. Cortelyou's concerns weren't vague or theoretical either. He'd expressed specific anxiety about the layout of the building, the size of the crowds, and the lack of any real screening process for visitors. McKinley, true to his reputation for accessibility, waved away these worries, telling his secretary that no one would want to hurt him. It's one of those historical moments that reads almost unbearably tragic in hindsight, a trusted advisor sensing danger clearly enough to act on it twice, only to be overruled by a president determined to remain close to the people he served. Whether Cortelyou's warning could have prevented what happened next remains impossible to know for certain, but it's hard not to wonder what might have changed had McKinley listened just one more time. 56. The Secret Service's limited role. It might surprise you to learn that in 1901, the Secret Service wasn't actually tasked with protecting the president at all. The agency had been created decades earlier for an entirely different purpose, investigating counterfeit currency. Presidential protection was still an informal, almost improvised arrangement, cobbled together from local police, personal aides, and whichever agents happened to be available. At the Pan American Exposition, a small number of Secret Service agents were present near McKinley, but their role was more ceremonial than protective, and their numbers were nowhere near sufficient for a crowd of that size. There was no formal training for threat assessment, no established protocol for screening visitors, and no dedicated unit whose sole job was keeping the president alive. It's a striking reminder of just how differently security was approached at the time, especially considering 2 previous presidents had already been assassinated within living memory. McKinley's shooting finally exposed just how inadequate this patchwork system truly was. It would take this 3rd assassination in less than 40 years to convince Congress that presidential protection needed to become an official, permanent responsibility rather than an afterthought. 57. James Parker's intervention. Among the crowd waiting in line that day was a man named James Parker, a large, imposing figure who happened to be standing just behind Czolgosz when the shots rang out. Accounts vary slightly on the exact sequence of events, but most agree that Parker reacted almost instantly, lunging forward and striking Czolgosz in the face before guards could fully react. His intervention likely prevented Czolgosz from firing additional shots, since witnesses reported the assassin had been attempting to raise his weapon again when Parker knocked him off balance. Parker was an African-American man working at the exposition, and in the aftermath, some newspapers downplayed or altered his role in subduing the shooter, a frustrating pattern reflecting the racial biases of the era. Other accounts credited him fully, describing him as the first person brave enough to physically confront the attacker. Regardless of exactly how the story unfolded, Parker's quick action remains one of the few moments of clear heroism amid the chaos of that afternoon. His contribution to preventing further violence deserves recognition, even if history hasn't always been consistent about giving it to him. 58. McKinley's first concern. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, as guards wrestled Czolgosz to the ground and chaos erupted around him, McKinley's first instinct wasn't concern for his own condition. Witnesses reported that the wounded president, blood visible on his shirt, urged the crowd not to harm his attacker, reportedly saying something to the effect of, "Don't let them hurt him." It was a remarkable display of composure and restraint from a man who had just been shot twice at point-blank range. Some historians view this moment as reflecting McKinley's genuine character, a man known throughout his life for kindness and even temperament, extending that same grace even towards someone who had just tried to kill him. Others note that shock and adrenaline can produce unexpected reactions, making it difficult to draw firm conclusions about intent in such a chaotic moment. Either way, the quote became one of the most repeated details of the assassination, held up in newspapers nationwide as evidence of McKinley's gentle nature. Whether it was genuine mercy or simply reflexive shock, it left a lasting impression on how the public remembered him in his final days. 59. The X-ray machine. In one of history's more haunting near misses, an X-ray machine was actually on display just steps away at the exposition itself, part of the fair's celebration of cutting-edge technology. Doctors treating McKinley reportedly discussed using the device to help locate the bullet still lodged inside him, but ultimately decided against it. Some accounts suggest they worried about unknown side effects, since X-ray technology was still extremely new, and its risks weren't fully understood. Others point to simple logistics, concerns about moving the machine, uncertainty about how to operate it properly, or hesitation about trying an experimental method on the President of the United States. Whatever the reasoning, the decision meant doctors were left relying on manual exploration and guesswork rather than modern imaging to locate the remaining bullet. It's a strange historical footnote that the very technology capable of revealing exactly where the threat lay was present at the scene, yet went unused. Historians still debate whether using it might have changed the outcome, though there's no way to know for certain given how limited medical understanding of X-rays truly was at the time. 60. The missing bullet. Surgeons operating on McKinley managed to locate and remove one of the two bullets fired by Kolgos, but the second proved frustratingly elusive. Working without X-ray guidance, in a room with imperfect lighting, doctors probed and searched, but ultimately couldn't determine exactly where the second bullet had come to rest inside McKinley's body. Rather than risk further invasive searching, they made the decision to close the wound and leave the bullet in place, believing it posed less immediate danger than continued exploratory surgery. This decision would later become a point of intense scrutiny and debate as McKinley's condition worsened in the following days. Some medical historians argue the retained bullet contributed directly to the infection that ultimately killed him, while others suggest the surgical techniques and hygiene standards of the era were the larger underlying problem regardless of the bullet's location. What's certain is that the missing bullet became a symbol of just how limited medical capabilities still were at the turn of the 20th century, even as technological marvels surrounded the very hospital where McKinley lay dying. 61. McKinley's temporary recovery. In the days immediately following the surgery, there was a wave of cautious optimism that swept through the country. Doctors issued statements suggesting the president's condition was stabilizing, and newspapers ran headlines declaring that McKinley appeared to be on the road to recovery. He reportedly asked for food, sat up in bed, and even joked with those attending him, small moments that convinced his medical team the worst might be behind him. Crowds gathered outside the Milburn residence, celebrated the encouraging news, and telegrams of relief were sent across the nation. Vice President Roosevelt, upon hearing the positive reports, felt comfortable enough to continue his vacation in the Adirondacks rather than rushing back to Buffalo. Some historians believe this premature optimism reflected genuine medical improvement, at least temporarily, while others argue the doctors underestimated the severity of internal damage that ultrasound or imaging today would have easily detected. Whatever the true state of his body during those days, the sense of relief proved tragically short-lived. Within roughly a week, that hopeful narrative would unravel completely, replaced by a sudden and devastating turn that caught nearly everyone, including his own physicians, entirely off guard. 62. The gangrene complication. The optimism surrounding McKinley's recovery collapsed when doctors discovered that gangrene had set into the tissue surrounding his wounds. Without antibiotics or the kind of infection control modern medicine relies on, there was little physicians of the era could actually do once the infection took hold. McKinley's condition deteriorated rapidly, moving from apparent stability to critical decline within a matter of hours rather than days. His heart, weakened by the spreading infection, began to fail, and by September 14, 1901, just over a week after the shooting, McKinley was dead. Some medical historians point directly to the undetected second bullet and the lack of proper wound cleaning as the source of the infection, while others argue that even with modern antiseptic standards, survival would have remained uncertain given the extent of internal injury. What's largely agreed upon is that the gangrene, not the bullets themselves, ultimately proved fatal. It was a brutal illustration of medicine's limitations at the turn of the century, a reminder that surviving the initial trauma was sometimes only the beginning of the real danger. The nation, having celebrated his recovery just days earlier, now found itself plunged into shock and mourning almost overnight. 63. The Milburn House. McKinley spent his final days not in a hospital, but inside a private residence, the Buffalo home of John Milburn, president of the Pan American Exposition. It had seemed like the most practical option at the time, close to the exposition grounds and equipped to host distinguished guests, so it was quickly converted into a makeshift medical facility once the shooting occurred. Doctors and nurses moved in and out constantly, medical equipment was brought in as needed, and the Milburn family essentially handed their home over entirely to the effort of saving the president's life. It's a strange detail to sit with, that one of the most consequential moments in American political history unfolded inside someone's private living space rather than an actual hospital. The Milburn house became, for those final days, the center of the nation's attention, with reporters and concerned citizens gathering outside for updates. After McKinley's death, the home carried the heavy weight of that history, forever associated with the final chapter of his life. It stands as a quiet reminder of just how personal and improvised presidential care still was at the dawn of the 20th century. 64. Roosevelt's Adirondack journey. When McKinley's condition first appeared to stabilize, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt decided to continue a planned vacation with his family in the remote wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains. It seemed like a reasonable choice at the time. The president was reportedly improving, and there was no immediate indication that Roosevelt's presence was urgently required. He and his family were staying near Mount Marcy, New York's highest peak, largely cut off from telegraph communication and the rapid flow of news updates that might have kept him informed of any sudden changes. This isolation would soon become a significant problem, as McKinley's condition took its fatal turn far faster than anyone anticipated. Roosevelt was essentially unreachable during a critical stretch of time, tucked away in dense forests with no easy way for messengers to reach him quickly. It's a striking historical detail that the man about to become president was, for a brief window, almost completely off the grid, while the nation's leadership hung in the balance. The scramble to locate him and deliver the news would become one of the more dramatic footnotes of the entire crisis. 65. The Midnight Ride to North Creek. Once messengers finally located Roosevelt deep in the Adirondacks and delivered the grim news that McKinley was dying, there was no time to waste. Roosevelt needed to reach a train station as quickly as possible, but the nearest one was miles away, accessible only by rough mountain roads in the dead of night. He climbed into a horse-drawn wagon and set off on a harrowing journey through darkness, rain, and treacherous terrain, racing against time toward the station at North Creek, New York. Different drivers reportedly took turns handling the wagon as horses grew exhausted, pushing through the night at breakneck speed along roads never designed for that kind of urgency. By the time Roosevelt reached the station, McKinley had already died, though word hadn't yet caught up with him during the journey itself. It's a scene almost cinematic in its intensity, a future president racing through the wilderness in the dark, unaware he was already at that very moment leader of the nation. The Midnight Ride to North Creek remains one of the more dramatic and lesser-known chapters surrounding this entire tragic transfer of power. 66. Roosevelt's sudden presidency. When Theodore Roosevelt finally arrived in Buffalo and took the oath of office, he became, at 42 years old, the youngest person ever to hold the presidency, a record that still stands today. Unlike presidents who spend years anticipating and preparing for the role, Roosevelt stepped into it abruptly, thrust into leadership under circumstances of grief, confusion, and national uncertainty. There was no time for a lengthy transition or careful planning. He simply had to begin governing immediately, with the entire country watching how he'd handle such a sudden and heavy responsibility. Some historians view this abrupt beginning as shaping much of Roosevelt's approach to the presidency, a sense of urgency and decisiveness that would come to define his time in office. Others caution against reading too much into the circumstances of his ascension, noting his personality had always leaned toward bold, energetic action, regardless of how he arrived in power. Either way, his presidency marked a striking generational shift, a young, vigorous leader stepping into a role usually associated with older, more seasoned statesmen. It was a beginning defined entirely by tragedy, but it set the stage for one of the most transformative presidencies in American history. 67 Skollgås's brief trial. Leon Skollgås's murder trial moved with a speed that seems almost unimaginable by today's standards, lasting a mere 8 hours spread across 2 days. The proceedings began just over a week after McKinley's death, with public outrage still raw and the entire nation demanding swift justice. His court-appointed attorneys, former judges who reportedly didn't even want the case, offered little in the way of a defense, and the jury took less than an hour to reach a guilty verdict. Some legal historians argue this haste reflected the extraordinary circumstances of an assassinated president and understandable public pressure, while others contend it represented a troubling disregard for due process, a rush to conviction rather than genuine justice. Skollgås reportedly showed little emotion throughout, having already confessed to the shooting shortly after his arrest. There was no real mystery about who pulled the trigger, but the speed of the trial left little room for exploring questions about his mental state, his motivations, or whether anarchism as a broader movement bore any responsibility. It stands as a stark example of how quickly the machinery of justice could move when a nation wanted closure, even if that closure came at the expense of careful deliberation. 68 Emma Goldman's name in the chaotic aftermath of the shooting. Investigators scrambled to understand what had driven Skollgås to violence, and one name kept surfacing: Emma Goldman, the prominent anarchist speaker and writer. Skollgås had reportedly attended one of her lectures in Cleveland shortly before the assassination, and later claimed her words inspired his actions, though the exact nature of that influence remains debated among historians. Goldman was arrested and questioned extensively, with authorities hoping to uncover evidence of a broader anarchist conspiracy behind the shooting. She denied any direct involvement or prior knowledge of Skollgås's plans, insisting she'd simply given a speech he happened to attend among many others. Ultimately, no charges were filed against her, as investigators found no concrete evidence linking her to the actual plot. Some historians view this episode as an example of guilt by association, a government eager to blame an entire political movement for one man's actions. Others suggest the scrutiny was a reasonable response given genuine anarchist violence occurring across multiple countries at the time. Goldman's public notoriety only grew afterward, and she remained a controversial figure in American political life for decades, forever loosely tied in the public imagination to a killing she insisted she had nothing to do with. 69 Skollgås's execution, justice, or at least the legal conclusion of the case, moved just as quickly as the trial itself. Leon Skollgås was executed by electric chair at Auburn Prison in New York on October 29, 1901, less than 2 months after McKinley had died from his wounds. Witnesses reported that his final words expressed no remorse, and he reportedly stated he didn't regret killing what he considered an enemy of working people, though accounts of his exact final statements vary somewhat between sources. The execution drew significant public attention, with newspapers covering every detail of his final hours. Some historians point to the remarkably fast timeline, from shooting to trial to execution in under 2 months, as evidence of a justice system operating under intense political and emotional pressure rather than careful, deliberate process. Others argue that given his confession and the overwhelming evidence, a lengthy legal battle would have served little practical purpose. Whatever the interpretation, Skollgås's swift execution effectively closed the criminal chapter of McKinley's assassination almost as quickly as it had opened, leaving behind unanswered questions about his motivations that would linger in historical discussions for generations afterward. 70. The Auburn Prison Autopsy. Following his execution, prison officials conducted an autopsy on Skollgås's body, a practice that reflected certain unsettling medical and legal customs of the era. Reports from the time indicate that sulfuric acid was poured over his remains before burial, intended to destroy the body entirely and prevent any possibility of it becoming a shrine or rallying point for sympathizers. His personal belongings and letters were reportedly destroyed as well, an attempt to erase virtually every physical trace of his existence. Some historians view this as an extreme but understandable reaction, given the intense public fear and anger surrounding presidential assassinations at the time. Others see it as reflecting a broader discomfort with treating even convicted criminals with basic dignity, a punitive impulse extending beyond death itself. The autopsy findings themselves reportedly focused on studying his brain, part of a broader era fascination with trying to identify physical or biological markers that might explain violent or radical behavior, a practice now widely regarded as pseudoscientific. It's a grim footnote to an already dark chapter, illustrating how thoroughly authorities wanted to erase Kulgus from history, even as his actions had already reshaped it permanently. 71. The Secret Service's new duty. Before McKinley's assassination, presidential protection wasn't formally guaranteed by any single agency, an oversight that seems almost unthinkable given later assassination attempts and threats. The Secret Service had actually existed since 1865, but its original purpose was combating counterfeit currency, not guarding the nation's chief executive. Following McKinley's death, the third presidential assassination, in less than 40 years after Lincoln and Garfield, Congress finally acted, formally assigning the Secret Service permanent responsibility for protecting the president in 1902. Some historians view this as a long overdue and obvious response, questioning why it took 3 assassinations for the government to establish consistent protection. Others note that presidential accessibility had long been considered an important democratic value, something officials were reluctant to sacrifice even amid growing security concerns. The new protective duties expanded gradually over subsequent decades, eventually growing into the extensive security apparatus surrounding modern presidents today. It's a striking reminder that many institutions we now consider fundamental and obvious weren't established through careful foresight, but rather through tragedy. 3 presidents had to die before basic, dedicated protection became standard practice. 72. McKinley's last words. As McKinley lay dying, those present at his bedside reported that his final coherent words included lines from his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," a piece with deep personal and religious significance for him. Witnesses described him reciting the familiar words softly as his condition deteriorated in those final hours. Some historians find these reported final words entirely consistent with McKinley's well-documented religious devotion throughout his life and political career. Others note that accounts of famous last words, especially from historical figures, should always be treated with a degree of skepticism, given how easily such moments become romanticized or embellished in retelling after the fact. Whether entirely accurate or slightly polished by those recording the moment for history, the story resonated deeply with a grieving public. Newspapers across the country printed the account, and the hymn itself saw a notable surge in popularity following his death. It became closely associated with his memory, sung at memorial services held in his honor nationwide. Whatever the precise truth of his final words, they offered the country something it desperately needed in that moment, a sense of peaceful closure to an otherwise violent and sudden tragedy. 73. The Canton funeral train. After McKinley's death, an elaborate funeral train carried his body from Buffalo back to his beloved hometown of Canton, Ohio, retracing a journey that had once been filled with hope during his presidential campaigns. The train stopped in numerous cities along the route, allowing thousands of mourners to pay their respects as the casket passed through, a slow, deliberate journey that gave the nation time to process its grief collectively. Crowds gathered at every station, some waiting for hours just to catch a glimpse of the passing train, a testament to how deeply McKinley's death had affected ordinary Americans. Historians note that this kind of elaborate funeral procession had become something of a somber tradition following presidential assassinations, echoing similar scenes after Lincoln's death decades earlier. Some view these processions as genuine expressions of national mourning, while others suggest they also served a political purpose, reinforcing stability and continuity during moments of crisis. Whatever the deeper motivations, the sight of that train winding its way toward Ohio became one of the defining images of McKinley's death, a physical manifestation of a nation's collective sorrow, slowly making its way home to rest. 74. The McKinley Monument. In Canton, Ohio, McKinley's final resting place became a grand memorial, unlike anything the small city had seen before, a massive dome structure perched atop a hill, visible for miles around. Construction took years and required significant public fundraising, with donations pouring in from citizens across the country, eager to honor their fallen president. The monument's design, featuring a striking granite dome and sweeping staircase, was meant to convey both dignity and permanence, a fitting tribute befitting a leader who died in office. Some historians view the monument's grandeur as reflective of the genuine public affection McKinley inspired during his presidency, particularly given his reputation as an approachable, kindly figure. Others note that such elaborate memorials often say as much about a nation's need for closure and meaning-making after tragedy as they do about the individual being honored. Today, the McKinley Monument remains a notable historical site, drawing visitors interested in presidential history, though it receives considerably less attention than memorials dedicated to Lincoln or other more widely remembered assassinated presidents. It stands as a quiet, somewhat overlooked reminder of just how significant McKinley's death felt to Americans at the time. 75. The Temple of Music's fate. The very building where McKinley was shot, the Temple of Music at the Pan American Exposition, met a rather unceremonious end once the fair concluded. Like most structures built for World's Fairs and expositions during this era, it had never been intended as permanent architecture, constructed instead from relatively cheap materials meant to dazzle visitors temporarily before being torn down. Following the exposition's closure in late 1901, the Temple of Music was demolished along with most of the other exhibition buildings, erasing the physical location where one of the era's most consequential shootings had occurred. Some historians find this rather fitting, noting that World's Fair structures were never meant to last regardless of the events that happened within them. Others suggest there's something oddly poignant about the disappearance of a site so significant to American history, a place where presidential assassination unfolded, reduced to rubble within months. No physical marker exists today at the original location, though Buffalo has acknowledged the historical significance through other means. It's a curious footnote, illustrating how quickly physical spaces tied to major historical events can vanish, leaving only photographs, written accounts, and memory behind. 76. Kennedy's Dallas motorcade route. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy's motorcade wound through the streets of Dallas as part of a planned public appearance intended to shore up political support in Texas ahead of the upcoming election. The route had been published in local newspapers beforehand, a standard practice at the time meant to allow crowds to gather and see the president, though it also meant anyone with harmful intentions knew exactly where the motorcade would travel. As the procession moved through downtown Dallas, it eventually turned into Dealey Plaza, an area surrounded by buildings, including the Texas School Book Depository. Historians and investigators have spent decades examining the specific decisions behind this route, including a sharp turn that slowed the motorcade considerably. Some view the route selection as entirely routine, a standard path chosen for practical logistical reasons common to presidential visits. Others have raised questions over the years about the security implications of the chosen path, particularly given the slow turn near the depository building. Whatever the intentions behind it, that particular stretch of Dealey Plaza became forever linked with one of the most scrutinized and debated events in American history. 77. The Open Limousine. Kennedy traveled through Dallas in a specially modified 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, known within Secret Service circles by the designation SS-100X. The vehicle had been extensively customized for presidential use, featuring extended body length, special flooring, and retractable steps for Secret Service agents, though notably it lacked bulletproof protection for its occupants. Riding in an open convertible allowed crowds a clear view of the president, a deliberate choice reflecting the era's emphasis on accessibility and public connection between elected leaders and citizens. Some historians note that this openness, while it fostered goodwill and public enthusiasm, also reflected a security philosophy that seems strikingly different from today's heavily fortified presidential vehicles. Others point out that even by 1963 standards, some officials had expressed concerns about using an open car in a large city with mixed political sentiments. The Lincoln itself later became a significant piece of physical evidence, extensively examined and eventually retrofitted with armor and a permanent roof for continued government use. It stands today as one of the most studied vehicles in American history, a physical artifact permanently tied to a moment that changed the nation. 78. The Bubble Top Decision. The presidential limousine actually came equipped with a removable transparent roof, sometimes called a bubble top, designed to offer some protection from weather while still allowing crowds to view the president inside. On the morning of November 22nd, weather reports and skies over Dallas had cleared considerably after earlier rain concerns, leading to the decision to leave the bubble top off entirely for the motorcade. It's worth noting that this particular covering wasn't bulletproof anyway, offering protection primarily from rain rather than any security threat. Some historians emphasize this detail specifically to counter persistent myths suggesting the bubble top's absence was somehow deliberately arranged to enable an attack, pointing out it wouldn't have stopped bullets regardless. Others note that the decision reflects how thoroughly weather and public visibility factored into presidential security planning during this period, sometimes more prominently than protection from potential threats. The clear skies that morning, initially seen as fortunate for the public visibility of the president, later became forever entangled with the tragic events that followed. It remains a small but frequently discussed detail among those who continue examining every aspect of that fateful day. 79. Kennedy's Texas trip. The visit to Texas in November of 1963 wasn't simply a ceremonial stop, it carried real political weight for President Kennedy as he looked ahead to the 1964 election. Texas represented a state with deep internal divisions within the Democratic Party, and Kennedy hoped his presence alongside Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Governor John Connally might help smooth over tensions between competing factions. The trip included stops in San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth before the fateful arrival in Dallas, each appearance drawing large, enthusiastic crowds that seemed to suggest the trip was accomplishing exactly what it set out to do. Some historians view this tour as a fairly standard bit of political maneuvering, the kind of coalition building any president might undertake before a re-election campaign. Others point out that Texas in 1963 carried a particularly charged atmosphere, with extremist rhetoric circulating in certain corners of Dallas specifically, something aides had reportedly flagged as a concern beforehand. Whatever the underlying political calculations, the trip was intended to project strength and unity. Instead, it became one of the most consequential presidential visits in American history, remembered for entirely different reasons than anyone could have anticipated when the planning began months earlier. 80. The Texas School Book Depository. As the motorcade made its way through Dealey Plaza, shots rang out that investigators would trace back to the 7-story Texas School Book Depository building, a nondescript brick structure that had housed textbook distribution operations for Dallas area schools. The building sat directly along the motorcade's altered route, close enough that its upper floors offered a clear line of sight over the plaza below. In the chaotic moments following the shots, witnesses scattered in different directions, some pointing toward the building, others toward a nearby grassy knoll, creating conflicting accounts that investigators would spend years trying to reconcile. The official investigation concluded that the shots originated from within the depository itself, based on physical evidence gathered in the hours and days that followed. Some historians and researchers accept this conclusion as thoroughly supported by ballistic and forensic evidence collected at the scene. Others have continued questioning aspects of the acoustic and eyewitness testimony, arguing the full picture remains incomplete even decades later. The building itself was eventually preserved rather than demolished, an unusual choice for a structure tied to such tragedy, and it now houses a museum dedicated to examining that day from multiple angles and perspectives. 81. Lee Harvey Oswald's employment. Lee Harvey Oswald had only started working at the Texas School Book Depository a little more than a month before Kennedy's visit, taking a job that involved filling book orders and moving boxes throughout the warehouse. The timing struck investigators as significant, given how the position placed him inside a building directly overlooking the motorcade's planned path through Dealey Plaza. Oswald had a complicated personal history by that point, including a defection to the Soviet Union years earlier and later involvement with pro-Cuba political activities after returning to the United States. Some historians view his employment at the depository as simply coincidental, a low-wage job he'd obtained through an ordinary personal connection with no larger significance beyond convenient timing. Others find the coincidence harder to accept, pointing to his political background and questioning whether the job placement carried any deeper meaning worth examining further. Oswald was arrested later that same afternoon, found in a nearby movie theater after the shooting of a Dallas police officer. He denied involvement in the assassination during his brief time in custody and was killed himself 2 days later before ever facing trial. leaving many questions about his employment and intentions permanently unresolved. 82. The sixth floor window. Investigators zeroed in on a corner window on the sixth floor of the depository's southeast corner, identifying it as the location from which the fatal shots were believed to have been fired. Witnesses below reported seeing movement near that window shortly before and after the shots rang out, and investigators later discovered boxes arranged near the window in a manner some suggested could have formed a makeshift shooting perch. Spent cartridge casings were found nearby, along with a rifle discovered hidden among stacks of boxes elsewhere on the same floor. The physical layout of the window offered an angled view down onto Elm Street, precisely where the motorcade would have passed at a reduced speed. Some historians consider the window evidence conclusive, tying together ballistics, eyewitness accounts, and physical positioning into a coherent narrative. Others have raised questions over the years about the angle of certain wounds and whether they align perfectly with a shooter positioned at that specific window. The sixth floor space has since been preserved almost exactly as it appeared that day, allowing visitors to see firsthand the vantage point that became central to one of the most examined crime scenes in American history. 83. The Mannlicher Carcano Rifle. Investigators recovered a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle from the sixth floor of the depository, an Italian-made weapon chambered for 6.5mm ammunition that had been purchased months earlier through a mail-order catalog under an alias later linked to Oswald. Fingerprint evidence, along with a paper bag found near the window believed capable of concealing the disassembled rifle, connected the weapon directly to the sixth floor location and to Oswald's presence there that morning. Ballistics testing matched cartridge casings found at the scene to this specific rifle, forming a central pillar of the official investigation's conclusions. Some historians view this physical evidence chain as remarkably solid, connecting purchase records, fingerprints, and ballistics into a cohesive account. Others have questioned aspects of the rifle's accuracy and firing speed, wondering whether the weapon's bolt-action mechanism could realistically achieve the shots within the timeframe investigators proposed. Test firings conducted afterward produced mixed results depending on the marksman involved. The rifle itself remains preserved as physical evidence, examined and re-examined by researchers, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike, each generation bringing new scrutiny to a weapon that became inseparable from the tragedy in Dealey Plaza. 84. The Zapruder Film. Abraham Zapruder, a local dressmaker who'd brought his home movie camera to capture the presidential motorcade, ended up recording roughly 26 seconds of 8mm film that would become perhaps the single most scrutinized piece of footage in American history. Standing on a concrete pedestal near the grassy knoll, Zapruder captured the motorcade's approach and the horrifying moments that followed, footage he initially sold to Life magazine rather than releasing publicly given its graphic content. For years, most Americans only saw still frames or verbal descriptions rather than the actual moving footage, until bootleg copies and later official investigations brought fuller versions into public view. Some historians consider the film an invaluable, unimpeachable record, offering a precise timeline investigators used to establish shot sequencing and timing. Others have spent decades analyzing individual frames, arguing certain moments suggest movements inconsistent with the official conclusions about the number and direction of shots fired. The film's frame-by-frame scrutiny arguably launched an entirely new era of citizen investigation into the assassination. Zapruder himself reportedly struggled emotionally with having filmed the tragedy, a piece of personal history he never anticipated when he grabbed his camera that ordinary Friday morning. 85. The Parkland Hospital Dash. As the motorcade sped away from Dealey Plaza, Kennedy's limousine raced toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, just a few minutes away, in a desperate attempt to save his life. Doctors and nurses on duty that day had no idea they were about to receive the President of the United States, mortally wounded, in Trauma Room 1. A team of physicians worked frantically, performing a tracheotomy and attempting resuscitation, though the severity of the head wound left little hope from the moment he arrived. Governor John Connally, also wounded in the shooting, was rushed into a separate operating room and would eventually survive his injuries. The hospital scene became chaotic within minutes, with Secret Service agents, medical staff, and eventually the traveling press all converging on a facility never designed for an event of this magnitude. At 1 p.m. Central Time, Doctors pronounced Kennedy dead. Some historians view Parkland's efforts as a valiant, if ultimately futile, response given the severity of the injuries. Others have focused on the hospital's medical observations as a source of ongoing debate. Either way, Parkland Memorial Hospital became forever linked to one of the most tragic afternoons in American history. 86. The disputed autopsy questions. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington aboard Air Force One, where an autopsy was later performed at Bethesda Naval Hospital rather than at Parkland, a decision that has fueled debate for decades. Doctors at Parkland had described the head wound in ways that some researchers argue differ from later official autopsy findings, creating discrepancies that have never been fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The autopsy photographs and X-rays were classified for years, only gradually becoming available to independent researchers and historians. Some experts maintain that the official autopsy conclusions are sound, attributing early discrepancies to the chaos of the moment and differences in medical perspective. Others argue the inconsistencies raise legitimate questions about the number, direction, and timing of the shots fired that day. The Warren Commission relied heavily on this medical evidence to support its conclusions, while later independent investigations, including a House committee in the late 1970s, reached somewhat different interpretations of the same data. Even now, forensic pathologists occasionally revisit the case, offering fresh analysis of decades-old evidence. The disputed autopsy remains one of the most persistently debated elements of the entire Kennedy assassination story. 87. The presidential oath on Air Force One. Less than 2 hours after Kennedy was declared dead, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One, still parked on the tarmac at Dallas Love Field. The decision to administer the oath immediately, rather than waiting until returning to Washington, reflected concerns about ensuring a clear and uninterrupted transfer of power during an uncertain and frightening moment for the country. Photographs from inside the cramped cabin show a somber Johnson, flanked by Kennedy aides and his own wife, Lady Bird, as the brief ceremony unfolded. Some historians view the quick swearing-in as a necessary and reassuring demonstration of constitutional continuity amid national chaos. Others have noted the unusual circumstances, an oath taken on an airplane, surrounded by grief-stricken aides, as a stark symbol of just how abruptly the country's leadership had changed hands. The plane then flew back to Washington carrying both the new president and Kennedy's casket, a haunting juxtaposition that underscored the surreal nature of that entire day. This moment remains one of the most iconic images associated with the transition of American presidential power. 88. Judge Sarah Hughes. The person who administered that hurried oath aboard Air Force One was federal judge Sarah T. Hughes, a longtime friend of Lyndon Johnson who happened to be in Dallas that day. Her selection made her the first woman in American history to administer the presidential oath of office, a historic milestone that occurred almost by circumstance rather than deliberate planning. Hughes had been appointed to the federal bench years earlier, and Johnson reportedly trusted her enough to request her presence for this unprecedented moment. Some historians view her involvement as a fitting, if unplanned, footnote highlighting how ordinary personal connections often shape extraordinary historical events. Others point out that her selection reflected the improvised nature of the entire transition, decisions made quickly under enormous pressure with whoever happened to be available and trusted. Hughes herself later described feeling the immense weight of the moment as she read the oath aloud in the cramped cabin. Her role remains a notable, if often overlooked, piece of the larger Kennedy assassination story, a reminder that history sometimes turns on the presence of people who simply happen to be nearby. 89. Jackie Kennedy's pink suit. Throughout the swearing-in ceremony and the flight back to Washington, Jacqueline Kennedy remained in the same pink Chanel-style suit she had worn that morning, now stained with her husband's blood. She reportedly refused offers to change clothes, later explaining that she wanted people to see what they had done to him. The image of her standing beside Johnson during the oath, still in that suit, became one of the most haunting visuals associated with the assassination. Some historians view her decision as a deliberate, almost defiant act of bearing witness during an unbearable moment. Others see it simply as shock and grief, with no larger symbolic intention behind it at all. The suit itself was later preserved, wrapped in acid-free paper, and stored at the National Archives, though it has never been publicly displayed out of respect for the Kennedy family's wishes. It remains sealed away, a physical remnant of that tragic day that few have ever seen firsthand. 90. Oswald's arrest. About 80 minutes after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald inside the Texas Theater, where he had ducked in without paying admission. Officers had already been searching for a suspect connected to the earlier shooting death of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, a killing many investigators later linked directly to Oswald's escape route from the depository. Oswald reportedly resisted arrest, drawing a revolver before being subdued by several officers inside the theater. Some historians view his rapid capture as compelling evidence of guilt, given the trail of witnesses and physical evidence connecting him to both shootings. Others have questioned aspects of his behavior that day, wondering why he would linger nearby rather than flee the city entirely. Oswald denied shooting Kennedy during his subsequent interrogation, though no recordings of those interviews were ever made, a fact that continues to frustrate historians. 2 days later, before ever standing trial, Oswald himself would be shot and killed, leaving his arrest as the final chapter he'd personally witness in an unfolding American tragedy. 91. Officer J.D. Tippit. Before Oswald was ever cornered inside the Texas Theater, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot and killed on a quiet residential street just a few miles from the Texas School Book Depository. According to official investigations, Tippit had stopped a man matching the description of the president's shooter and was gunned down within moments of that encounter. Witnesses at the scene identified Oswald as the shooter, and shell casings recovered nearby were later matched to a revolver found in his possession at the time of his arrest. Some historians view Tippit's killing as the crucial link connecting Oswald directly to the assassination, a rapid and violent escalation that revealed a man desperate to avoid capture. Others have raised questions about inconsistencies in witness testimony, timing, and the physical evidence collected that day, arguing the case deserves closer scrutiny even now. Tippit's death received far less public attention than Kennedy's, overshadowed almost immediately by the larger tragedy unfolding around it. Yet for investigators piecing together Oswald's movements that afternoon, the shooting became one of the most important and most debated pieces of the entire timeline. 92. The Texas Theater arrest. After allegedly shooting Officer Tippit, Oswald continued moving through Dallas neighborhoods before slipping into the Texas Theater without paying for a ticket. A sharp-eyed shoe store manager nearby had noticed him acting suspiciously and alerted police, who quickly surrounded the building. Officers entered the darkened theater, lights still on inside, and confronted Oswald in his seat. He reportedly punched an officer and attempted to draw his revolver before being physically subdued and taken into custody. Some historians view the arrest as a fitting, almost cinematic end to a frantic pursuit, connecting the dots between the depository, the Tippit shooting, and Oswald's capture within a tight and coherent timeline. Others note the strange choice to duck into a movie theater rather than flee the city, wondering what exactly Oswald intended to do next. The theater itself later became something of a historical landmark, still standing today as a physical reminder of that chaotic afternoon. For many investigators, the arrest represented the moment the case seemed to close. For others, it only marked the beginning of decades of unanswered questions. 93. Jack Ruby's shooting 2 days after his arrest. As Oswald was being transferred between jail facilities in front of live television cameras, nightclub owner Jack Ruby stepped forward from the crowd and shot him at close range. The moment was broadcast to a stunned national audience, one of the first instances of a killing occurring live on American television. Oswald died shortly afterward at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the very same facility where Kennedy had been pronounced dead just 2 days earlier. Ruby was immediately wrestled to the ground and arrested, later standing trial for murder. Some historians view Ruby's actions as a spontaneous, emotionally driven act carried out by a man distraught over the president's death. Others have long suspected deeper motives, pointing to Ruby's connections with organized crime figures and questioning why he had access to the heavily guarded transfer area at all. The shooting effectively silenced the only person who could have publicly answered questions about his own actions and motivations. To this day, historians and researchers continue debating whether Ruby acted entirely alone or whether his presence that morning was somehow arranged in advance. 94. Ruby's claimed motive. During his trial, Jack Ruby offered a surprisingly personal explanation for why he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. He claimed he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the pain of returning to Dallas and testifying at a public trial, sparing her the ordeal of reliving her husband's death in front of cameras and courtrooms. Ruby framed himself as a grieving patriot, someone overcome with emotion in the days following the assassination, acting out of sympathy rather than any hidden agenda. Some historians accept this explanation at face value, noting Ruby's documented emotional instability and his genuine admiration for the Kennedy family. Others find the story difficult to believe, especially given Ruby's ties to Dallas nightlife figures and rumors of underworld connections that were never fully investigated. Ruby was convicted of murder, though the verdict was later overturned on appeal. He died of cancer in 1967, while awaiting a new trial, taking whatever deeper motivations he may have had to his grave. Whether his claimed motive was the full truth or a convenient explanation remains one of the many unresolved mysteries surrounding those chaotic days in Dallas. 95. The Warren Commission. In the aftermath of the assassination, President Johnson established a special commission led by Chief Justice Earl Warren to investigate exactly what had happened in Dallas. After nearly a year of testimony, evidence review, and analysis, the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted entirely alone in killing President Kennedy, firing 3 shots from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The commission found no evidence of a broader conspiracy, foreign or domestic, behind the assassination. Some historians view the report as a thorough and reasonable conclusion given the evidence available at the time, praising its methodical approach despite the immense pressure surrounding the investigation. Others have criticized the commission for moving too quickly, overlooking inconsistencies, and relying heavily on incomplete forensic evidence. The report became the official government position for over a decade, shaping public understanding of the assassination for a generation of Americans. Yet doubts persisted, fueled by unanswered questions about ballistics, witness testimony, and Oswald's own background. The Warren Commission's findings remain one of the most scrutinized government reports in American history. 96. The House Select Committee finding. In the late 1970s, a renewed congressional investigation revisited the Kennedy assassination with fresh eyes and updated forensic techniques. The House Select Committee on Assassinations ultimately concluded that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy, a striking departure from the Warren Commission's earlier findings. Acoustic evidence, later disputed by other experts, suggested the possibility of a second gunman firing from the grassy knoll area. However, the committee could not identify who else might have been involved, nor could it determine the nature or scope of any conspiracy. Some historians view this finding as validation of long-standing public suspicions that Oswald did not act entirely alone. Others point out that the acoustic evidence supporting a second shooter was later challenged and largely discredited by subsequent scientific analysis. The contradictory conclusions of these 2 major government investigations have left the American public with lingering uncertainty rather than closure. Decades later, historians, researchers, and casual observers continue debating which findings deserve more weight, ensuring that the true story behind Kennedy's assassination remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. 97. The 1978 acoustics evidence. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the Kennedy case in the late 1970s, much of their conspiracy conclusion rested on a single piece of technical evidence, a Dallas police recording that captured sounds from the moment of the shooting. Acoustic experts analyzed the recording and believed they detected an extra gunshot, one that couldn't be accounted for by Oswald's rifle alone, suggesting a second shooter firing from the grassy knoll. This finding electrified the public and seemed to confirm decades of suspicion that the official story was incomplete. However, in the years that followed, other scientists and audio specialists re-examined the same recording and reached very different conclusions. Some argued the timing was off, that the recorded sounds didn't align properly with the actual sequence of shots, and that background noise had been misinterpreted as gunfire. The National Academy of Sciences eventually reviewed the evidence and expressed serious doubts about its reliability. Some historians still view the original acoustic analysis as a legitimate, if imperfect, clue pointing toward a broader conspiracy. Others consider it a case of enthusiastic scientists finding patterns that weren't really there. A well-intentioned mistake that briefly convinced the government to change its official position. Either way, the acoustic evidence remains a strange footnote, a moment when cutting-edge technology promised answers, but ultimately deepened the confusion surrounding one of America's most examined afternoons. 98. The National Archives records. Buried within the vast holdings of the National Archives are millions of pages of documents related to the Kennedy assassination, an almost overwhelming paper trail spanning FBI reports, CIA memos, witness statements, and internal government communications. Congress passed a law in 1992 requiring the release of these records within 25 years, a response to renewed public interest sparked by Oliver Stone's film and growing frustration over decades of government secrecy. When the deadline arrived in 2017, thousands of documents were released, though several batches remained withheld for reasons of national security, prompting further delays and public skepticism. Some historians view the ongoing releases as proof that the government is finally being transparent about a case shrouded in suspicion for generations. Others question why any records still need protecting more than 60 years after the assassination, wondering what could possibly remain sensitive after all this time. Researchers continue combing through the released files, occasionally finding small new details about surveillance, informants, or agency communications, though nothing that has fundamentally overturned the established narrative. The sheer volume of material ensures that historians will likely be studying these records for decades to come, sifting through bureaucratic language and redacted passages in search of answers. For a case that supposedly closed with the Warren Commission, the National Archives tells a very different story, one still very much unfinished. 99. Kennedy's state funeral. 3 days after the assassination, the nation watched as President Kennedy's funeral procession moved solemnly through the streets of Washington, D.C., a moment of collective mourning captured on television screens across the country. Among the many haunting details of that day was a riderless horse named Black Jack, walking directly behind the caisson carrying Kennedy's casket, a traditional military symbol representing a fallen leader. Black Jack was known for being spirited and difficult to control, and on the day of the funeral he lived up to that reputation, prancing and resisting his handler as the procession moved forward. Attached to his saddle were empty boots, deliberately placed backward in the stirrups, an old military custom meant to represent a fallen warrior, looking back one final time upon his troops. The image of that riderless, restless horse became one of the most enduring visuals from the entire funeral, striking many observers as an almost eerie reflection of the nation's own unsettled grief. Some historians note that Black Jack later became something of a celebrity himself, appearing in later state funerals before his death years afterward. Others simply remember him as a small but unforgettable detail from an otherwise unbearably heavy day, a single horse somehow capturing the mixture of order, tradition, and raw sorrow that defined Kennedy's final journey through the Capitol. 100. The Eternal Flame at Arlington. At Kennedy's gravesite in Arlington National Cemetery, his widow Jacqueline Kennedy made a request that would become one of the most enduring symbols of his presidency, an eternal flame burning continuously beside his final resting place. During the burial ceremony, she leaned forward and lit the flame herself, a quiet, deeply personal gesture amid the formal military rituals surrounding her husband's funeral. The flame was designed to burn indefinitely, a constant reminder of Kennedy's legacy and the sudden, shocking way his presidency had ended. Engineers worked to ensure the flame could withstand wind, rain, and snow, eventually developing a specially designed device capable of reigniting itself automatically if it were ever extinguished. Some historians view the eternal flame as a fitting tribute to a president whose life and death captured the world's attention, a small piece of fire meant to represent something lasting amid so much uncertainty. Others note the quiet irony that the flame, meant to burn forever, sits atop a case, still filled with unanswered questions, competing theories, and documents yet to be fully released. Visitors continue traveling to Arlington each year to see it flicker beside the modest gravestones marking Kennedy's resting place. Whatever conclusions history eventually settles on, the flame remains a steady, glowing reminder of a presidency cut short and a mystery that has never fully faded from the American imagination.